She signed her name on a Tuesday morning, and the man who had shared her bed for 22 years stood in the doorway and watched her do it like he was waiting for a package to be delivered. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. He had the company, the attorneys, the accounts, and the kind of confidence that only comes from never once imagining you could lose. She had $37 in her personal checking account, a rolling suitcase by the front door, and something else, something he had never once thought to look for. A plan. So here is the question that is going to stay with you for the next 60 minutes. What does a woman do when the most powerful person in her life hands her nothing, and assumes she will stay nothing? What you are about to hear is a story about power. Not the loud, obvious kind, not boardrooms full of men making noise about their own importance. This is about the quiet kind, the kind that builds in silence, the kind that nobody notices until it is already too late to do anything about it. Diana Mercer had spent 22 years being the most capable person in every room she walked into, and for 22 years she had allowed one man to be the only person in those rooms who never noticed. That was not an accident. And as you are about to discover, neither was what came next. This is not a story about a woman who got lucky. This is not a story about a woman who got angry. This is a story about a woman who got organized, at a level that most people, even people who consider themselves strategic, would find genuinely difficult to comprehend. To understand how Diana Mercer ended up sitting across a conference table from two attorneys and a settlement offer that amounted to an insult dressed in legal language, you have to go back, not to the marriage, not even to the affair, but to a city in Ohio and a woman who had been learning how the world actually worked long before she ever met Robert Mercer. Diana grew up in Dayton, Ohio, a city that has spent the better part of a century learning how to rebuild itself after being told it was finished. Her father worked the floor of a manufacturing plant for 31 years. Her mother ran the reference desk at the local public library. Neither of them had money. Both of them, by every account of people who knew the family, had an extraordinary amount of discipline, the kind that gets passed down not through instruction, but through observation, through watching adults make hard decisions without drama and without complaint. Diana absorbed all of it. She was, from a very early age, the kind of person who read the fine print. She earned her business degree from Ohio State University in the mid-1990s, worked 2 jobs simultaneously to pay down her student loans before the interest had a real chance to accumulate, and by her late 20s had positioned herself as a junior analyst at a regional investment firm in Cincinnati. People who worked alongside her during that period have described her in remarkably consistent terms: precise, understated, and almost unnervingly patient. She was not the loudest person in any meeting. She was, however, reliably the person who had read every document that everyone else had only skimmed. She had a gift for seeing the architecture underneath the surface of things, for understanding not just what a deal was, but how it was structured, where its pressure points were, and what would happen to it under stress. That gift, as it turned out, would become the most consequential thing about her, not immediately, but eventually, in ways that nobody in her orbit had thought to anticipate. There is a particular kind of intelligence that the professional world consistently undervalues, and Diana Mercer had it in abundance. It is not the intelligence that performs well in presentations or sounds authoritative in conference calls. It is the intelligence that functions best when it is invisible, when it is operating in the background of a situation, mapping its terrain, identifying its fault lines, and building contingency plans that nobody else in the room knows exist. The people who underestimate this kind of intelligence do so because they confuse quietness with passivity. They see a woman who does not demand credit and conclude that she does not notice the absence of it. They see a woman who absorbs information without reacting and conclude that she is not processing it. They see a woman who waits and conclude that she has no plan. Robert Mercer made all 3 of those mistakes. He would spend the rest of his professional life understanding exactly how expensive they were. She had one close friend from her Cincinnati years, a woman named Carol Simmons, who later became a compliance officer at a different regional firm, who told a mutual acquaintance something that stuck with everyone who heard it. Carol said that Diana had a habit, even in her 20s, of finishing every difficult conversation with a variation of the same phrase. She would listen to the whole thing, the bad news, the unreasonable demand, the dismissal, and then she would say very quietly, "All right, let me think about that." Not as a deflection, not as politeness, as a genuine statement of intent. She was going to think about it. She was going to think about it very carefully for as long as it took, and when she came back to the conversation, she was going to be ready in a way that the other person was not. That habit never left her. It simply grew larger and more precise as the stakes around her increased. She met Robert Mercer at an industry conference in Cincinnati in the spring of 1998. He was 34 years old, recently divorced from a brief first marriage that nobody in his professional circle talked about openly, and in the process of building Mercer Capital Group from a spare bedroom in Columbus into something that deserved to be taken seriously. He was not the most polished person in the room. He was, however, the most certain. There is a particular quality that some founders carry, a complete inability to imagine failure that reads, at least from a distance, as vision, and Robert had it in concentrated form. Diana, who had spent her career surrounded by people who hedged and qualified and spoke in probabilities, found it genuinely compelling. What she did not yet understand, what took her several years to understand fully, was that the certainty she found attractive was not a sign of depth. It was a sign of limitation. Robert Mercer was certain because he had never seriously reckoned with the possibility of being wrong. Their professional partnership preceded the romantic one by about 8 months. Diana began consulting for Mercer Capital Group in late 1998, initially on a contract basis, assessing the firm's operational infrastructure and identifying the compliance gaps that Robert had been too busy chasing deals to address. What she found was a firm with genuine potential and almost no internal scaffolding, a company that was growing faster than its systems could support, held together largely by Robert's personality and the goodwill of his early clients. She spent 3 months building systems that should have existed from the beginning. She built reporting protocols, investor communication frameworks, a compliance calendar, a board documentation structure. She did it quietly and without fanfare, and at the end of the 3 months Robert's early investors were getting better information more reliably, and the firm was running with a steadiness it had never had before. Robert noticed. He made her an offer. She accepted. They married in June of 2000 at a small ceremony in Columbus. By that point she had been working inside the firm for 18 months and had restructured most of its operational backbone. The marriage, in a way that both of them understood at the time, was also a merger. She brought precision, institutional knowledge, and an operational rigor that the firm genuinely needed. He brought the deal flow, the client relationships, and the public face of the company. It was, in purely functional terms, an excellent arrangement. The firm grew steadily through the early 2000s, managed the 2008 financial crisis with a level of discipline that most of its competitors in the regional private equity space could not match, a fact that Diana's meticulous risk management protocols had a great deal to do with, and by the early 2010s was managing well in excess of $400 million in assets. Robert was profiled in regional business publications. He spoke at conferences. He gave quotes to the Columbus Dispatch about the resilience of the Midwestern economy. Diana's name appeared in almost none of it. That, too, had been an arrangement she had accepted. Arrangements have a way of calcifying if you are not careful. The first time Diana understood with certainty that something had fundamentally changed between them. She was standing at the back of a conference room in Chicago in the spring of 2014. She had spent 6 weeks preparing the firm's annual investor presentation, the research, the narrative, the data visualization, the rehearsal. It was, by any professional standard, excellent work. The morning of the presentation, Robert told her he would deliver it himself. No discussion, no explanation. He walked to the front of the room and presented for 45 minutes. He did not mention her name once, not in the presentation, not in the Q&A, not in the small talk afterward over coffee. Diana stood at the back of the room for the entire 45 minutes and listened to a man describe work she had built, in language that made it sound like his own instinct, to an audience that had no reason to believe otherwise. When he finished, she shook hands with the room and drove herself back to the hotel. She did not bring it up that night. She did not bring it up the next morning. She filed it away in the part of her mind that was already, without her fully knowing it, beginning to build a record. Before we go further, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to hear from you. And if you have not already, hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming stories. Now, let us keep going, because it is about to get a great deal more complicated. The affair began by the most reliable reconstruction of events, sometime in the fall of 2015. Her name was Jennifer Caldwell. She was 31 years old, worked within the vendor network that serviced Mercer Capital Group's technology infrastructure, and had been introduced to Robert at a firm dinner in October of that year. Diana found out the way that most people in her position find out, not through a dramatic confrontation, not through a confession, but through the accumulation of small inconsistencies that individually mean nothing and collectively mean everything. The changed passwords. The phone placed face down on surfaces it had never been placed face down on before. The trips to Cleveland and Indianapolis and Louisville that were described as client development, but that generated no new client documentation in the months that followed. The shift in the quality of his attention, not hostile, not guilty seeming, simply elsewhere. The way a person's attention goes when it has found a more interesting place to be. Diana said nothing for 8 months. That fact alone is worth pausing on. 8 months of watching, of logging, of understanding the full dimensions of what was happening before she made a single visible move. There are people who would read that as passivity. There are people who would read it as denial. What it actually was, as the subsequent months would make brutally clear, was reconnaissance. She was not waiting for the situation to resolve itself. She was waiting until she understood it completely, until she knew not just what Robert was doing but why, and what it meant for the firm, and what it meant for her position within it, and what options she would have when the time came to act. She was, in the most precise sense of the word, preparing. She was also, during those 8 months, spending a great deal of time with a black composition notebook that she kept in the pocket behind the passenger seat of her car. The notebook, and this detail matters, so hold on to it, was an ordinary composition book purchased from a drugstore in Columbus sometime in the fall of 2016. She did not keep it in the house. She kept it in her car, in a place that a person not specifically looking for it would never think to check. She wrote in it in the precise, almost architectural handwriting that everyone who has ever received a document from Diana Mercer describes in the same terms. She wrote dates and figures and observations. She wrote the names of people she intended to speak with, and the questions she needed answered before she could speak with them. She wrote down the structure of the firm's board of directors and the relationships between its members. She wrote down the history of every shareholder agreement she could reconstruct from memory, and from the documents she still had access to in her capacity as the firm's head of operations. And she wrote down, on a page near the middle of the notebook, 2 words that she circled 3 times in ballpoint pen board structure, and beneath them, a series of names with notations beside each one that would not have meant anything to a person who didn't know the firm. To someone who did know the firm, they were a map of exactly where the pressure points were. Robert finally initiated the conversation about divorce in January of 2017. He did not do it at home in private, the way a person does when they still have some residual respect for the shared life they are ending. He did it in a conference room at the firm's offices, with 2 attorneys present and a settlement document already printed and waiting on the table. It was a move designed to communicate a very specific thing, that this was already decided, that the parameters had already been set, and that her role in the conversation was to sign the document and accept the terms. The settlement offered her $210,000, a lump sum, paid over 6 months, a non-disclosure agreement covering the details of their marriage and the firm's operations, and a full waiver of any claim to Mercer Capital Group or its assets. In exchange, she had to sign immediately. There was no counteroffer mechanism built into the document. There was no language that anticipated negotiation. It was structured by 2 very good attorneys to feel like the end of a conversation that had already concluded without her. She looked at the document for a long time. She asked one question, whether she could take it to her own attorney to review. Robert's lead attorney said that the offer was time-sensitive and that the terms were not subject to material revision. Diana nodded. She picked up the pen, and she signed it. The 2 attorneys exchanged a glance that Diana noticed and filed away. Robert, for the first time that morning, looked visibly relieved. She gathered her coat, picked up her bag, and walked out of the conference room without a word. She did not cry in the elevator. She did not call anyone from the parking garage. She drove home, packed the last of the boxes she had already prepared. She had been packing quietly for 3 weeks, loaded them into her car, and drove to the small apartment she had quietly leased the previous month under her maiden name. She made 1 phone call that evening. It lasted 11 minutes, and the person on the other end of that call was not a friend. It was a corporate attorney who specialized in minority shareholder rights. Here is the piece of information that Robert Mercer's attorneys had not accounted for, and it is worth taking a moment to understand exactly why they missed it. When Mercer Capital Group was incorporated in Columbus, Ohio in 1997, before Diana was involved, before the firm had any serious assets, when it was still a 1-person operation running out of a spare bedroom, Robert's first attorney had drafted the firm's original operating agreement. That attorney was a generalist, not a specialist in corporate law, and the document he produced was competent but not particularly sophisticated. It contained a provision, standard in some early-era operating agreements, that listed a small number of founding-era contributors as minority silent shareholders. These were people who had provided non-financial support to the firm in its earliest months: introductions, referrals, early credibility. One of those people was a woman who had since left the industry entirely. Another was a former professor of Roberts from Ohio State who had died in 2009. And one of them, added to the document in a revised filing in 1999, when Diana first began doing serious operational work for the firm, was Diana Mercer. 8%, vested, non-dilutable without unanimous board consent. Robert had never moved to extinguish that stake. The reason, most likely, is that he had forgotten it existed. The operating agreement was 12 years old by the time of the divorce, had been superseded in most of its operational provisions by more recent filings, and the minority shareholder clause was buried on page 31 of a document that his current attorneys had reviewed only at the summary level when preparing the divorce settlement. 8% was not control. 8% was not even a meaningful voice in ordinary business operations. 8%, to a man managing $400 million in assets, was a rounding error, the kind of legacy provision that you clear up eventually when you get around to it, but never treat as urgent because why would you? It is the kind of thing that sits in a filing cabinet for 12 years and means nothing, right up until the moment it means everything. Diana had known about that 8% for years. She had watched it sit in the original operating agreement through every subsequent revision, every new filing, every updated shareholder document, and she had never once brought it to Robert's attention. Not because she was planning to use it, not in those early years when the marriage was still functional and her position within the firm was still what it had been agreed to be, but because Diana Mercer was the kind of person who read the fine print, and the fine print had told her that this provision existed, and she had simply kept that knowledge in the part of her mind where she kept things that might one day matter. By 2016, she understood that it was going to matter. By January of 2017, sitting across the table from Robert's attorneys with a settlement document in front of her, she knew exactly how. The settlement she had signed covered her personal assets, her marital claims, her rights to the marital home and the joint accounts and the shared property. It did not, could not, without her separate consent as a shareholder, cover her equity stake in the firm. Robert's attorneys had drafted a document that assumed her only connection to Mercer Capital Group was as Robert's wife. They had not looked closely enough at the original operating agreement to understand that she also had a connection to it as a founding-era minority shareholder, and that those two legal relationships were entirely distinct. The settlement extinguished one of them. It left the other completely intact. Diana had read every word of the settlement document before she walked into that conference room. She had read it with her own attorney 2 days before the meeting, at an office on the other side of Columbus. She had known, before she sat down, exactly what the document did and did not cover. She signed it because it gave away nothing she had not already decided she could live without. In the weeks after the divorce, Robert told people in his professional circle that Diana had taken the settlement gracefully, that she had been, given the circumstances, unexpectedly cooperative. He said this in the tone of a man who has gotten away with something and is mildly surprised by how easy it was. He told at least 2 colleagues that Diana had always been more of a background person, good at the operational work, not really built for the high-pressure side of the business. He said it without apparent awareness of how precisely that description captured his own role in what was coming. He had spent 22 years watching Diana operate in the background. He had concluded from that observation that the background was where she belonged. What he had not understood, what he had never understood, was that the background is where you build things without being watched. The morning after she signed the divorce settlement, Diana Mercer woke up at 5:45 in her new apartment, made coffee, and opened the black notebook. She had been building toward this moment for the better part of a year, and she did not waste time processing it emotionally. She had already processed it. She had processed it in the car on the way home from the conference room, in the 11-minute phone call that evening, in the 3 weeks of quiet preparation that had preceded the meeting itself. What she did on that Wednesday morning was begin the operational phase of a plan that was already fully formed. She worked for 4 hours without stopping. By 9:30, she had a list of 7 people she needed to speak with, and a sequencing strategy for approaching each of them that had been designed, with the care of someone who understands how information moves through a professional network, to ensure that no conversation would alert any other party before she was ready. The first name on the list was Gerald Huang. Gerald was 63 years old, a founding-era board member of Mercer Capital Group, who had joined the board in 2001, when the firm was still small enough to need the credibility that his name provided. He was a retired partner from a larger Columbus area investment firm, well respected in the regional financial community, and had held his seat on Mercer Capital's board through every subsequent governance restructuring. Over the previous 18 months, he had grown increasingly uncomfortable with the direction Robert was taking the firm, specifically with a series of management fee adjustments that had been implemented without the full board notification that the firm's governance documents required. He had raised the issue twice in board meetings. Both times, Robert had acknowledged the concern, promised to have his legal team review the documentation process, and then done nothing visible in response. Gerald was frustrated. He was also, as Diana knew from years of watching the firm's internal dynamics, the kind of man who responded to being ignored by becoming very, very quiet, and then, when the moment was right, very, very precise. The second name was Patricia Ng. Patricia was one of Mercer Capital Group's two outside investors, individuals who held board seats by virtue of their investment stakes rather than their operational roles. She had seeded the firm with $12 million in 2008, at the exact moment when most rational investors were running in the opposite direction, on the strength of a risk management framework that she found genuinely impressive. That framework had been Diana's work. Patricia knew it, even if the public record didn't reflect it clearly. Over the previous 2 years, Patricia had been trying to arrange a comprehensive audit of the firm's fee structures and investment performance attribution, a routine request from a major investor that Robert had been deflecting with a series of scheduling delays and procedural objections that had grown, by the time of the divorce, into what Patricia privately described as an unacceptable pattern of obstruction. She was not yet ready to escalate. She was, however, ready to listen. There is a concept in organizational dynamics, sometimes described as coalition building, and it is one of the most consistently misunderstood strategic tools available to someone in a minority position. Most people think of coalition building as a process of accumulating allies, of finding people who agree with you and persuading them to act. What Diana understood, and what the notebook reflected with remarkable precision, is that coalition building is actually a process of identifying people who already have interests that align with yours, and then creating the conditions in which those interests can be pursued simultaneously. She was not going to ask Gerald Huang to help her. She was going to give him the opportunity to do something he already wanted to do. She was not going to ask Patricia Ng to take a risk on her behalf. She was going to give Patricia the information she needed to pursue the audit she had already been trying to conduct for 2 years. Diana was not building a coalition. She was unlocking one that already existed. She just happened to have the key. Diana met with Gerald Huang for the first time since the divorce on a Thursday afternoon in late February of 2017, at a coffee shop in the Short North neighborhood of Columbus, a place she had chosen carefully because it was far enough from the firm's offices to be genuinely neutral, busy enough to be unnoticed, and the kind of place where two people having a long conversation over coffee would attract no particular attention. She had prepared for the meeting with the same methodical care she brought to everything, which meant she had thought through not just what she wanted to communicate, but exactly how much of it to communicate, and in what sequence, and what she needed Gerald to arrive at on his own. She did not ask him for anything at that first meeting. She did not present him with a proposal or a strategy or a timeline. She asked him how the board meetings had been going. She listened for 40 minutes. And then she said very quietly, "Gerald, I think there are some documents you might find useful. I am not suggesting anything. I just think you might find them useful." The documents she gave Gerald Huang at a second meeting 10 days later were a series of financial summaries she had assembled over a period of months during her tenure as the firm's head of operations. They were not dramatic documents on the surface. They did not contain accusations. They did not contain conclusions. They contained data, specifically, a longitudinal comparison of the firm's management fee structures across 12 quarters, laid out in a format that made it straightforward to observe that the fees charged to investors had increased by approximately 22% over a 4-year period, without the board notification and investor disclosure that the firm's own governance documents required. Diana had built these summaries not as weapons but as records, the kind of records that a meticulous operations person keeps, because that is what meticulous operations people do. She had been keeping them since 2014. She had them with her when she left the firm. Nobody had thought to ask her to return them because nobody had understood that they existed. Patricia NG received a manila folder at a lunch meeting in early March. Diana had chosen the restaurant, a quiet Italian place in the short north that Patricia had mentioned once years earlier as somewhere she liked, and had arrived 15 minutes early and was seated at a corner table when Patricia walked in. The lunch lasted 2 hours. Diana spent the first 45 minutes listening to Patricia's frustration with the audit delays, to her concerns about the fee structure, to the specific procedural objections Robert's team had used to block her requests. She listened without interrupting and without taking notes because she had already anticipated every point Patricia was going to make and had already prepared a response to each one. When Patricia finished, Diana set the folder on the table and pushed it gently across. She said, "I am not telling you what to do with this, but I think it answers some of the questions you've been trying to ask." Patricia opened the folder. She looked at the first 3 pages. She looked up at Diana. And she said, "How long have you had this?" Diana said. "Long enough." Patricia NG hired an independent forensic accounting firm within 2 weeks of that lunch. The audit was framed as a routine investor review, which technically it was, since Patricia had been requesting exactly this review for the better part of 2 years, and was well within her rights as a major investor to conduct it. The accounting firm completed its preliminary review in 30 days, and produced a report that confirmed the pattern Diana's summaries had identified, with the additional finding that 2 of the fee adjustments had been implemented without any documented board approval whatsoever, not merely insufficient disclosure. Robert's attorneys received a copy of the preliminary report on day 44 after Diana had signed the divorce settlement. The timeline of that receipt was not an accident. Diana had known within a margin of a few days when the report would be ready. She had structured every preceding conversation with that timing in mind. Robert's response to the audit was immediate and characteristically confident. He instructed his attorneys to challenge the framing of the audit, to question the independence of the accounting firm, and to dispatch a letter to Patricia NG's legal counsel, asserting that the fee structures in question had been implemented in accordance with standard industry practice, and that any suggestion of governance failure was both factually incorrect and potentially actionable. It was the response of a man who had successfully used legal pressure to manage difficult situations before, and who had every reason to expect the same result here. What he had not accounted for was that Patricia NG was not, by any measure, a person who was susceptible to legal intimidation, and that the letter his attorneys sent her had the practical effect of converting a financial dispute into a personal one. Patricia had been patient and procedural for 2 years. She was done being patient on day 41 after the divorce settlement was signed. Diana Mercer's corporate attorney filed a formal request for a special board meeting of Mercer Capital Group on behalf of his client as a 5% or greater minority shareholder. The request was grounded in a provision of the firm's original operating agreement, the same 1997 document that contained the silent shareholder clause that gave any shareholder holding 5% or more the right to formally convene a special session of the board to address matters of governance concern. The provision had never been used. It had almost certainly never been read carefully by anyone in the firm's current legal team, because the operating agreement was 12 years old, and the provision it contained had no practical relevance to a firm of Mercer Capital's size and governance structure, until, suddenly, it had every relevance in the world. Robert's lead attorney sent a response letter within 48 hours, characterizing the filing as procedurally improper, legally frivolous, and motivated by personal rather than fiduciary concerns. It was a standard litigation posture, aggressive, dismissive, and designed to communicate that pursuing the matter further would be expensive and unrewarding. Diana's attorney had anticipated the response with enough precision that his reply was prepared before Robert's letter arrived. It addressed each of the procedural objections in sequence, cited the relevant provisions of Ohio corporate law, and included a supplementary filing that laid out the governance case with a level of specificity that made clear this was not a fishing expedition or an emotional reaction. It was a prepared legal argument that had been in development for months. Robert's attorneys read it and asked for 48 hours to confer with their client. The 48 hours stretched to a week. During that week, Robert made a series of moves that were individually reasonable and collectively disastrous. He reached out directly to Patricia NG with a settlement offer on the audit question, a partial concession on the fee structures, combined with a commitment to enhance disclosure going forward. Patricia declined. He reached out to Gerald Huang through an intermediary, floating the possibility of restructuring Gerald's board compensation in a way that would give him greater visibility into the firm's deal flow. Gerald listened politely and said he would take it under advisement, which is what Gerald Huang said when he had already decided something and was waiting for the right moment to act on it. Robert floated the idea, through his PR contact at a regional business journal, that the firm was in the process of conducting a voluntary strategic review and might bring in outside leadership to manage a transition period. The story was picked up and reported briefly, before being superseded by events that the journalist had not anticipated. What Robert did not do in that week was call Diana. He did not call her because he did not believe, even at that stage, that Diana was the primary architect of what was happening to him. He believed that Patricia NG was the principal adversary, that Gerald Huang was a secondary problem, and that his ex-wife, the woman he had handed a settlement and dismissed from the room, was a peripheral irritant. That belief was the most expensive mistake of his professional life. Every significant move that had been made against his position in the previous 6 weeks had originated in a black composition notebook in the pocket behind the passenger seat of a car. He had never once thought to look in. Every conversation that had been had, every document that had been delivered, every legal filing that had landed on his attorney's desks had been sequenced and timed and calibrated by a woman he had described to his colleagues as a background person. He was about to discover what happens when the background person decides to move to the front of the room. On day 63, Gerald Huang filed the paperwork to withdraw his proxy assignment from Robert Mercer and re-register his board seat as an independent vote. In the arcane procedural language of corporate governance, this was a small act. In the practical reality of Mercer Capital Group's board structure, it was seismic. Robert had held effective control of the board through a proxy arrangement that gave him 3 of the 6 votes, his own plus 2 that Gerald and one other member had assigned to him years earlier as a courtesy gesture that nobody had ever thought to revise. With Gerald's withdrawal, that arrangement collapsed. Robert now controlled 2 of 6 votes. He no longer had a majority. He no longer, in any operative sense, controlled his own board. The news moved through the firm's investor network within days. These things always do. The financial community in Columbus is smaller than it appears from the outside, and the people within it talk to each other in the particular coded language of people who have learned to communicate important information without technically saying it. What they communicated, in late April of 2017, was that Mercer Capital Group was in a governance transition of uncertain outcome, that the founder's position was under challenge from multiple directions, and that the situation was worth watching carefully. 2 of the firm's smaller investors made quiet inquiries about their redemption rights. One of the firm's mid-tier clients asked its relationship manager a question about continuity of service that the relationship manager could not fully answer. Robert held an all-hands meeting with the firm's staff that was intended to project stability and had roughly the opposite effect, because the people in that room had been working at Mercer Capital Group long enough to know the difference between a leader who is calmly managing a difficult situation and a leader who is managing his own anxiety about a situation he does not fully understand. Diana spent days 60 to 88 in her apartment, finishing the restructuring framework. It was a comprehensive document, a full operational and strategic blueprint for Mercer Capital Group covering governance reform, investor communication protocols, fee structure transparency, board composition, and a 5-year strategic direction for the firm. She had been building it since before the divorce. She had refined it through every development of the preceding months, incorporating everything she had learned from her conversations with Gerald and Patricia and the 4 other people on her list whom we have not yet discussed. It was not a document designed to seize control of a company. It was a document designed to answer the question that every serious stakeholder in Mercer Capital Group was now quietly asking: if not Robert, then what? She had the answer ready before anyone finished formulating the question. That was, of course, entirely intentional. On day 88, Patricia NG and Gerald Huang jointly submitted a formal nomination of Diana Mercer for the position of Chief Executive Officer of Mercer Capital Group. The nomination was submitted to the board in accordance with the firm's governance documents, which allowed for emergency CEO nominations in circumstances of material governance concern, a provision that, like the silent shareholder clause and the special meeting provision, had been included in the original operating agreement and never revised. The nomination cited Diana's founding-era contributions to the firm, her existing shareholder status, her operational expertise and institutional knowledge, and in language that must have landed on Robert's desk with considerable force, her preparation of a comprehensive strategic restructuring framework that the nominating board members described as the most complete and credible roadmap for the firm's future that they had reviewed. Robert's attorneys challenged the nomination on 3 grounds. First, they argued that Diana's shareholder status was improperly established, that the original operating agreement provision had been superseded by subsequent filings, and that her equity stake had been implicitly extinguished by the divorce settlement. Diana's attorney had anticipated this argument and had a 40-page brief ready that addressed it in detail. The brief cited Ohio corporate law, the specific language of the original operating agreement, the absence of any explicit extinguishment provision in the divorce settlement, and 3 comparable cases from other states in which founding-era shareholder provisions had been upheld against similar challenges. Second, Robert's attorneys argued that the nomination process itself was procedurally improper. Diana's attorney produced the relevant section of the governance documents in response and noted, without visible satisfaction, that the procedure had been followed precisely. Third, Robert's attorneys argued that the emergency CEO provision did not apply because there was no material governance concern of sufficient severity to trigger it. Patricia Ng's legal team responded to that argument with the preliminary findings of the forensic accounting audit. Nobody at the table said anything for a very long time. The emergency board meeting was held on day 90. Robert attended with his 2 remaining proxy-controlled votes and both his attorneys. Diana attended with Gerald Huang, Patricia Ng, and the 2 other independent board members who had, in the preceding 2 weeks, reviewed the restructuring framework and indicated, in the careful, non-committal language of people who have not yet officially committed, that they found it compelling. The meeting lasted 4 hours. Robert's attorneys made their arguments with skill and genuine conviction. They were good lawyers facing a well-constructed legal case, and they did the best they could with the position they had been given, which was a position built on the assumption that Diana Mercer had walked out of that conference room in January without a plan. Every motion they raised had been anticipated. Every procedural objection had a prepared response. Every argument they made had already been mapped in a black composition notebook that Diana had long since transferred into a formal legal brief. The vote was 3-2. Gerald Huang, Patricia Ng, and 1 independent board member voted in favor of the nomination. Robert and his remaining proxy voted against. The 3rd independent board member abstained, a decision that, given the margin, was irrelevant to the outcome, but that communicated something significant about the state of confidence in the room. Diana Mercer was appointed Chief Executive Officer of Mercer Capital Group on day 90. The same company she had helped build from a spare bedroom in Columbus into a $400 million operation. The same firm whose annual investor presentation she had written 6 times and delivered 0 times. The same boardroom where Robert had once answered questions about strategy for 45 minutes without mentioning her name. She sat at the head of the table and let the result stand in silence for a moment before she spoke. What she said first was, "Thank you, let's get to work." There is a particular quality to moments that are the product of long, patient, invisible effort, a quality that distinguishes them from moments that arrive through luck or force or accident. They tend to be quiet. They tend to arrive without drama, because the drama was expended in the building of them, in all the invisible hours that nobody witnessed and nobody documented, and nobody would believe if you described them. The 4 hours of that board meeting were not quiet in any ordinary sense. But the moment the vote was announced was quiet. Diana had known it was coming. She had known it for months. She had built the architecture that made it inevitable, piece by piece in a small apartment, with a notebook and a phone and the same methodical patience she had been applying to difficult problems since she was a young woman in Dayton, Ohio, reading the fine print that everyone else had skipped. Robert Mercer left the board meeting through a side exit. He did not speak to the press. He did not issue a statement. He retained his minority stake in the firm, a holding that, under Diana's subsequent governance reforms, was clearly defined in its rights and limitations for the first time in the company's history. He has not, by any account available, returned to the firm's offices in a professional capacity since the day of the vote. The attorneys he had retained for the divorce, for the governance challenge, and for the audit response collectively billed somewhere in the range of $600,000. The settlement he had paid Diana, the $210,000 he had described as generous, had been almost entirely reinvested in the legal and strategic preparation that produced the outcome of that board meeting. He had, in effect, funded the case against himself. The relationship with Jennifer Caldwell, the woman for whom he had ended his marriage, ended within months of the board vote. The details of that ending are not particularly relevant to this story, except insofar as they illustrate a pattern that people who study these situations tend to recognize, that the same capacity for treating people as instrumental that drives a man to betray a partner of 22 years tends not to stop at one relationship. Jennifer had, by most accounts, believed that she was different. She was not. She was simply next. People who knew Robert well, who had watched his professional trajectory over 2 decades, and who spoke about him in the careful language of people who do not want to be quoted, tended to describe him as a man who had always confused the support systems around him with his own capabilities. He had been, for 22 years, the public face of a machine that someone else was running. When the machine turned, he found that he did not know how to run it himself. Diana Mercer served as CEO of Mercer Capital Group for 3 years, before transitioning the firm to a new leadership structure of her own design. A structure built around a 4-person executive team with clearly defined responsibilities, transparent board governance, and a compensation framework that tied firm leadership pay to investor outcomes rather than asset accumulation. Under her leadership, the firm resolved its investor relations issues, completed a voluntary governance audit, and restructured its fee disclosure processes in a way that was later cited by a regional financial industry publication as a model for mid-market private equity transparency. She did not give interviews about the events that had brought her to the role. She did not tell her story publicly. She went to work. The restructuring framework, the document she had built in her apartment during those 90 days, became the operational foundation of the firm's transformation. People who reviewed it during the board meeting process described it in terms that were unusual in the dry language of corporate governance, as thoughtful, comprehensive, and clearly the product of someone who understood the firm not just from the outside, but from the inside out, from the roots up, from every angle that decades of meticulous, invisible work produces. It was, in a sense, the final accounting of everything she had contributed that had never been attributed to her. Not as a claim, as a demonstration. Here is what I know, here is what I built, here is what I can do, you can put my name on it now or not, either way this is the work. The notebook itself, the black composition book from the Columbus drugstore, was described by Diana's attorney, in a conversation with a colleague that eventually made its way into the professional network's memory of the case, as the most complete strategic document he had seen produced by an individual working alone under significant personal pressure. Every person on the list had been approached in the sequence the notebook prescribed. Every legal argument had been developed from foundations the notebook had identified. Every timing decision had been made in accordance with a schedule the notebook had mapped. It had been built over 18 months, in a car, in a small apartment, in the margins of an ordinary life that looked, from the outside, like the life of a woman who had accepted what she had been given. It was not. It had never been. There is a version of this story that frames it as a revenge narrative, the wronged woman who outsmarts the man who underestimated her. That framing is not wrong exactly, but it is incomplete in a way that matters, because Diana Mercer did not set out to destroy Robert Mercer. She set out to recover what she had built, and to do it in a way that was legally unassailable and professionally legitimate and structurally durable. The difference between those two motivations is the difference between a story that ends with a satisfying moment of reversal and a story that ends with something being actually repaired. She did not want to hurt him. She wanted to do the work she had always done, to run the machine she had always run with her name on the door this time. That is a different kind of ambition than revenge, and it produces different results. Revenge ends when someone suffers. What Diana was after ended when something worked. The question this story leaves with me, the question I find myself returning to long after the facts of it have settled, is not about Diana or Robert specifically. It is about the systems we build that make this kind of story possible. A woman spends 22 years building a company from the inside, contributing at every level, and the public record does not reflect her contribution. A man stands at a podium and takes credit for 45 minutes of work that someone else did, and the audience applauds. A settlement is drafted that assumes the only thing a woman brought to a 2-decade partnership was her presence as a wife. These are not unusual events. They are, in fact, remarkably ordinary events dressed up in extraordinary circumstances. What made Diana's story unusual was not the injustice, it was the response. Most people, handed a settlement and a rolling suitcase and a drive to a small apartment, would have cried for a week and started over. Diana Mercer bought a composition notebook and went to work. The rest, as they say, is a matter of public record, or in this case, of a record that she built herself, one page at a time, in the pocket behind the passenger seat of a car that nobody ever thought to look in. If this story stayed with you, if you found yourself thinking about the notebook, or the conference room in Chicago, or the moment the vote was announced, drop a comment below and tell me which moment hit you hardest. And I want to ask you something genuinely. Have you ever been in a room where the credit for your work went somewhere else? Tell me about it in the comments. The stories you share down there are some of the most important conversations that happen on this channel, and I read every single one of them. Next week, we are following the money in a case where the inheritance was entirely real, the family claiming it had the paperwork, and the one person who could disprove everything had been missing for 11 years. You are not going to see that ending coming. Make sure you are subscribed so you do not miss it. I will see you then.